Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of season 5 of Radical Embodiment, the podcast. Today, I am very honored to get to bring you Jill Miller. Jill is the founder of Tune Up Fitness. She is also the best-selling author of 2 books of Body by Breath, which we talk a lot about in the interview, as well as The Role Model. We just got done recording the conversation, and Jill's just somebody who is able to articulate and share her wealth of knowledge in a way that I believe is really digestible and tangible. So I think there's a lot of great insight and information that I think will hopefully serve you in your journey of desiring to be more in your body, of connecting with your breath. Jill shares a little bit of her own personal story, as a young teenager dealing with disordered eating, how she, started to roll on a towel every morning on her abdomen, and really what that brought up of her ability to start to actually feel her body and feel her core. So I hope you enjoy the interview. I know I learned and gained a lot from it, and I hope you do too. Hi, everyone. Here I am with Jill Miller. Jill, I'm really delighted and honored to get to have you on and get to interview you. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. It's really great to talk to somebody who's been through recovery and is speaking out about it and trying to describe the process of coming into one's body. So I'm excited to have the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Well, so speaking of that, inviting people to come into their body, I start these interviews with the question of what embodiment means to you.
I'm looking over at my dog, who's
My
fully
dog's
embodied.
behind. Oh, you can't. Mine's on the floor, just behind you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Haley is lounging. Her ability to self-regulate and to be able to act as an external regulator for me and my entire family is nothing short of Mother Teresa embodiment. She's like the perfect example. What does embodiment mean to me is that next level of awareness of how one's body can be a place of communication, can be a place of safety, can be a place of informing about thoughts, feelings, vibes, interactions. To know oneself, I feel, is really a story of the body's sense of self. So to me, that is my way of talking around what I think embodiment is.
Yeah, I like that. I love that you started with your dog too. He's sweet. What a great tangible example of these animals that regulate so well that, give us support. So I'd love to kind of dive into, your journey. And I was listening to an interview where you were interviewed last night on a podcast, and you were kind of sharing how you started, laying on towels on your abdomen and a little bit of your own, recovery through having an eating disorder. So I'd love to have you just share a little bit of that, if you don't mind, and kind of your journey and kind of the specifics too. I'm curious about how, why did you start to think of, laying on those towels and the abdominal? What kind of led you there? Self-release. And then what did that evoke internally for you?
Yeah. The story of my own disordered eating and recovery is a very long story. And my dysregulation around food started as a tween. I mean, I didn't have good nutritional habits from my family. I mean, I'm originally from New Orleans. I was drinking coffee at age 6.
Wow.
Oh yeah, like every morning. My mom was so awesome to let me have that early addiction to coffee. I just love coffee, and I don't blame her at all, because it's a very New Orleans thing. But I definitely was putting about 8 teaspoons of sugar per cup to make it palatable. I think back on that now and just think, oh my gosh, I don't know how I don't have any cavities. It's a gosh darn miracle. But I was overweight as a kid, and I was teased a lot for it. And I was very inactive. I was very sedentary. I had a sibling who was an athlete, so there was a really big contrast in our activity levels, but I just wasn't interested in movement. I liked books, I liked dolls, I liked walking with my dogs, playing with my dogs. That was pretty much the extent of my movement life. And we grew up in a solar home off the grid in outside of Santa Fe. So after New Orleans, there was a couple of moves, but we settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we didn't have TV out there because there was no reception. And one day, my mother was also on the heavier side, brought home the Jane Fonda workout and the Raquel Welch yoga video when I was in 6th grade, and put them in the beta player, which probably people don't even know what that is. But I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. So I was born in 1972. And beta was like, that was the good resolution videos. If you could, if you could buy the beta player. So we watched these videos. We participated in these videos, Jane Fonda workout and the Raquel Welch yoga video. And they were absolutely impossible for me. Like I was so out of shape, totally out of breath, but it was something that my mom wanted to do. And it felt like I could do it with her. And I think somewhere inside of me knew that it was probably a good idea to work out, because it was the like early 80s and the whole let's get physical was starting to, fitness culture was just having its first moment. And I think that somehow that lit my mom, and I started doing these videos. I started coming home every day after school and doing these videos back to back. And within 2 weeks, my mom dropped off, but I became absolutely obsessed with them. And looking back now, I can say, oh, there was the moment that my fuse was lit and an addiction to exercise was born. And along with the addiction to exercise, with, needing to do these videos to feel right, I started to stop eating. I basically started to restrict. And I went from 95 pounds at 4'9" to 65 pounds. Yeah. And it's a lot of weight loss. I mean, I was a tiny kid, but it's a lot of weight loss. And it just wasn't notable. Like nobody in my family really seemed to notice. And I hid it with baggy clothes. Until one day I remember looking at myself in the mirror and I could see all my ribs. And I just thought, oh, this isn't right. And at that point, I had been exposed to the notion of anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa through Jane Fonda again, by the way, because there was this show back in the day called 2020. And do you remember this show, this news?
I remember 2020.
Show? Okay, so it was like a newsy, lifestyle-ish show. And they did a piece on her about her bulimia. And she's such an activist. Like Jane is like amazing. And she talked about this binging and purging. And that's where I got the idea to binge and purge, was in her revealing this pain and this addiction and the suffering. I got the idea that might be something how I could control my urges and not gain weight. So I started to engage in bulimic behaviors in my early teens once I started eating again. So there's a lot more to the story, but how we get to the towels. Let's skip all the suffering. Let's skip all of the misery and the confusion and the self-hatred that went along with the chaos of disliking myself to such an extent that I was trying to run from everything inside of me. And so I was in college. I got into a really good school, went to Northwestern University. And in addition to being in college, I started to do work study at a massage studio. Started studying massage on the side. And I also was going to yoga classes in and around Chicago. And I must have gone to a yoga class somewhere in Evanston and confessed to the teacher, because this is what I remember. I confessed to the teacher that I couldn't feel my abs. And I knew I couldn't feel my abs because my roommate would come to me with the Pilates classes at the dance department. I managed to get my pre-med friend into the Pilates classes at the dance department. And she would always be really sore from doing Pilates. And I was never sore. My abs were never sore because I couldn't feel them. I was so disconnected from them. I was disembodied from my core, to use the word that we opened up the talk with, completely disembodied. Couldn't engage them, couldn't sense them. It was just this black hole of misery. And so I told this yoga teacher that I couldn't feel my abs and that I was bulimic and that I thought these things were connected. And so she said, well, lay down on this thing. And she handed me a bean bag shaped like a hamburger bun that was filled with sand. And it was a prop in the Iyengar yoga space that they used to use for headstands. And she said, lay belly down on it and breathe. And so I did that. I laid belly down on this prop, and I don't think I could breathe because I just felt visceral pain that permeated my entire body. It was horrible pain. But this pain somehow allowed me to not just feel the physical pain. I started to feel what I had been doing to myself for the past, 8 years.
Wow.
And I started to have real emotions. I started to cry, not from the physical pain, but from the agony of this rat race, this hamster wheel that I was stuck in, the inability to step off, to reflect, to feel my own feelings. And I knew there was something good about this discomfort. I knew there was something beneficial to that contact. And so I started to try to replicate it in my dorm room. And I would roll up a hand towel into the shape of a honey bun. And every morning, I would get up and I would probably drink water, go to the bathroom, and then I would move this towel around different places in my abdomen, all over. So I could breathe and feel and reveal and ultimately heal. And this was the initial process of embodying my feelings that were so stuck in my head or miles away from me. And then of course, fast forward, I have a prop called the Gorgeous Ball, which is much more tender and gushy than a rolled up towel or a sandbag. And I've figured out lots of best practices with this tool to really help to amplify the voices inside that have been starving to speak, that have been disavowed, that have been sublimated, that live in terror of expression. And that's what this Body by Breath, this second book that I wrote, so much of the work is about this titration of exposing the deep inside for relationship to oneself.
There's so much there that I could go deeper on, but let's start with kind of where you just finished of what you just said, that titration of going deeper, what's inside, because I think titration is such an important word. I think about it a lot in my work. So do you mind explaining kind of what do you mean by that? And Body by Breath, we'll go into that, like, because it's such an incredible tool. There was a night that I was staying in an Airbnb with some girlfriends for a week, and every night we would have that out on the living room. We'd randomly flip open a page, and that would be what we would do that night before bed. It was really, really sweet.
Oh my gosh. So
really nice.
Yeah. It's so beautiful.
It was beautiful. And it felt so good because I love that, like, even the Gorgeous Ball, you said it has gush. It's gentle. It's so important. I think when often we think about doing our own sort of tissue release, we think of like really intense foam rollers and like getting it out, which I'm like, no, like it can be gentle and soft so that our body
have to hurt to work.
Yes. So do you mind just kind of speaking to what you mean by that? How, like, the titration of going into what the body's wanting to reveal, and kind of the importance of that?
I mean, initially you can hear this description of how I lay down on this sandbag, which, laying on a sandbag is like laying on a concrete, block.
Yeah.
There's no give, there's no yield. It is incredibly dense. And the amount of pain I felt was proportionate to the hardness of that tool. And it was a wake-up call for sure. I mean, those were my organs that I was asking to behave in the most paradoxical way, right? Not only if you're very, very ill does your body need to throw up, right? So I had really reversed the order of things, and this blow to the belly, quite literally, was a stopgap for me. I wouldn't recommend it for people because I now know better what it is to ask your body to cope with those feelings, right? So when we say the titration, it's sensitively tiptoeing your way towards whatever that thing is, whatever that pain is, and having permission to also back off, go in, listen, breathe, emote, back out, take another couple of steps in, listen, up, door closed. All right, no problem. Walk away. I'll see you later. I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm here when you're ready. And that's really what that process is I'm here to be here for you, Jill, the self-talk, when you're ready. I don't need to force this, but I'm here. I hear you and I'm here, which is what nobody was for me, or at least my sense of things when I was a kid and unable to manage my own feelings of anger or disappointment or rage or terror. I didn't have people willing to hold the space for me then. So I had to teach myself to hold the space for me as an adult so that I could have whatever needed to leak out, whatever needed to express. And that process takes as long as it takes. It's still happening.
Yeah. That's what I love, that you just, the invitation of giving permission to back out, permission to come back. Like that's, I feel like, so important in our journey of being more in our body, being more in touch with emotions, what's present, how we feel. Of there's no like end goal, I feel like there's no like, oh, I'm going to get here, or I'm going to do this, or, because at least for myself, when I've had those moments of like my ego being like, oh yeah, I'm going to be like so embodied, I'm going to like do this thing, or I'm going to get this place. And it's just like, it's comical, right? Like, you take a moment to back out of like, right, this is a process. It's a journey. We're living in a human body our entire life. And yeah, there's no end goal of what we're trying to get at. I think it's just, give permission to come, breathe, be with it. And just, like, I'm here for you when you're ready. I love how you language that.
Yeah. I mean, but on the other hand, when I think about my colleagues or friends who are still struggling with bulimia or with anorexia, there is an end goal, which is to no longer engage in behaviors that are slowly killing you. And that's a whole other, segment of responsibility. And so, this is in recovery type of stuff that I'm talking about, or post-recovery type stuff. But when you're, I was intensely engaged in binging and purging when that moment happened. And it was an intervention that somehow changed the course of my life. Not in the presence of a therapist, not even in the presence of that yoga teacher, because she's like, oh, go and do this thing. She wasn't witnessing me. I was witnessing myself. So I think that it really is a really unusual turn of events that I was able to heal from behaviors that were leading towards, it's the number one cause of death of mental illness in young women and teen women are anorexia and bulimia. And so I feel like my life was spared and I got really lucky, but I do want to acknowledge that it is very helpful to have guidance. So if anybody's listening to this that's trying to stop the behaviors and they can't seem to, laying on a ball might be a part of your path, but it also might just be another annoying thing. And so we do really need to have multiple vectors of support in trying to claim our lives from anorexia and bulimia.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you stated that. So let's kind of go into into the breath and talking about the breath, especially because Body by Breath, your book just came out, and we'll have that linked. I guess I'll start with the question of what inspired that book, because that took a lot of, I mean, I can't imagine the amount of manpower. It's that, because it's a dense and like well researched. I mean, it's incredible, and it's, how many pages is it? Like 300, 400?
480 pages.
All right, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
480 pages. I can hold it up since we have a camera on.
Yeah.
It's a hardback
Textbook.
because it's so big. And my publisher, Victory Belt, they also specialize in cookbooks. So the paper that is makes up the book is high-end cookbook style paper. So you can't see through the pages to the images on the other side. You really see this incredible display of anatomy, of illustrations, photography, and of course writing. All
Yeah.
over the place. And they just really, their art direction is just so superb. When I got the first PDF of the art, yeah, it was one of those, I came down to my knees weeping, with gratitude. They really nailed the tone that I was trying to communicate with the book. So how did it come about? There's a number of different creation stories of how the book came about. One of the creation stories, my own story of healing, which we talked about already. Two is the story of my ancestors and my immediate family, many of whom died from COPD or breathing related diseases. My mother lives with chronic asthma and has had, I mean, when I was a toddler, I remember ambulances coming to the house in the middle of the night to get her. And I learned early that without breath, you die. And so that was a very strong motivation for me early on. I was also a singer. When I said I didn't do anything, like I really liked theater arts. Sorry. I loved singing. And so I remember a voice teacher when I was probably in 5th grade talking about the diaphragm. And I just was so intrigued by this muscle that was so responsible for our voice. So there are a few different vectors that informed my interest in breathing. And I think underlying all of this too, my dad is a doctor. He's a medical doctor, doctor of infectious diseases. So I grew up around the language, the clinical language of medicine and anatomy. And I was always really intrigued by all of his medical textbooks and all the pictures of anatomy, especially disease. I loved seeing cells and viruses and bacteria and fungus and what they did to the human body. So I actually originally wanted to be a microbiologist, but I didn't end up doing that.
I loved microbiology. That was one of my favorite labs in college.
Oh man, so cool, right? I reconsider it almost every day, by the way. So, but I've gone on to be a movement professional and to try to share relevant, applicable science with people, through the movement arts. So, my first book was called The Role Model, and The Role Model is a book about self-massage. It's about my approach to self-massage. And when the publisher reached out to me, they had seen me on a production of my friend Kelly Starrett, who's a physical therapist. He wrote the book Becoming a Supple Leopard, originally the creator of something called Mobility WOD, now the Ready State. I was on a broadcast that he did on a platform, on a really big web platform called Creative Live. This is in the it was like 2011, I think. And I did 2 presentations, one on fascia and one on breath. And when I finished the broadcast, I got an email from his publisher. He was in the middle of writing his book. And the publisher said, we want to publish your book. And I said, well, I don't have a book. And they said, well, write one and we'll publish it, which is completely never happens in the real world, but it happened for me. And so I had this golden egg handed to me. And I wanted to write this book. I wanted to write Body by Breath. I wanted to write my approach to breathing and fascia and core and the diaphragm. But I knew that in 2011, 2012, breath was not trending at all, except in the yoga space, which is pretty much where I lived. And so I decided that I would share out my approach to self-myofascial release, because I knew that was a rising trend and a really important aspect of recovery and regeneration. And so I wrote the role model. And as soon as I turned in that book, they said, "What's your next book?" And then I said, "Have I got a book for you?" And this was also before James Nestor had come out with his book. Luckily, James Nestor came out with his book because it took me 8 years to write Body by Breath. So during the writing of it,
a long time.
Yeah. Well, but you have to understand, like, some of the origin work in here was written over 2 decades ago. Because I taught courses. I taught a course called the Core Integration Immersion. My company, Tune Up Fitness Worldwide, I have 8 different trainings that I teach. One of them was called the Core Integration Immersion. I had a workbook, not a catalog, what's it called? Not a handbook, a manual. I had written training manuals for all of these 8 different courses. So I had the Core Integration Immersion. I also had another immersion called the Breath and Bliss Immersion. And so what I did with Body by Breath is I merged some of the information in those 2 manuals, but there was a lot more work to be done. These are not manuals. Body by Breath is not a manual. It's a textbook.
No, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well researched and cited, and it is a textbook. Amazing. Well, and what's coming to me right now is actually not even about Body by Breath, but is more about, I think this thing that surprised you, and it might be from the name of your first book it's not Tune Up, it's Roll.
The Role
Model. What is it called? The Role Model. Thank you.
ROLL.
Maybe it was from that book, but what the podcast that I mentioned earlier, I was listening to where you were interviewed on last night. You shared something that surprised you by that you thought you would get reports back of folks, increasing shoulder range of motion or pain in their body, or, more physically related releases. But what kept coming back to you time and time again was people having these emotional experiences. So I'm curious, have you speak to that and why you think that is? And so because I have this personal, just to interject really quick, this personal perspective in relationship to our fascia, that the more that we, the greater our fascial health, the greater sense of overall well-being we have, our emotional regulation. I think that, so I'm wondering, do you think it comes, what do you have to say about that? Do you think it comes from those times of just being present and slowing down? So it's kind of a lot of questions thrown in, but.
Yeah. So what Emily's talking about is, when I set out to write the role model, I did a call to action to all of our followers. And I asked people if they had a story they'd like to share about how the role model work had helped their life, or had helped their well-being, had helped them heal from an injury or disease or whatever. And I got dozens and dozens of stories. And I expected that there'd be stories on how I healed my knee and how I healed my back pain and how I healed my shoulder, how I healed my elbow. And there were those stories. But every single story, almost every single story that came through also had some extremely heavy emotional component. How I was able to deal with public speaking. How I dealt with my emotions while my son was in the hospital dealing with a drug overdose again. The number of the emotional weight that people were rolling for, in a way, outweighed the body-based fixings that I had expected. Because people definitely are rolling for their range of motion. They're rolling to ease aches and pains, but it's clear that the rolling induces a range of emotion. It allows them to experience true relief. It allows them to grieve. It allows them to anchor. It allows them to feel that which they were not feeling before. Somehow the rolling opens up this limbic floodgate that needs to express itself. And so what I see that coming into the body in a few different ways. Number one, this is a very tender approach to rolling. It's not aggressive. It's not trying to induce harm or bruising, which there are many other, companies out there that actually want you to bruise or want you to, damage capillaries. And that's not what this approach is asking you to do. It's asking for a lot of deep listening. It's asking you to amplify interoception, which is the ability to listen to physiological urges, to physiological phenomenon within your body. Amplify what pain is trying to tell you, but also transform your relationship to this body talk. One of the things I talk about in the book is this concept of my body thinks in feels. And so you're helping your body's IQ around its ability to speak what it's feeling to you. And how does that translate? It's not necessarily in your native tongue. It's not necessarily in English or Chinese or French or whatever your native tongue is, but it's your ability to process and sense what you're sensing instead of bypassing and blowing past it or continuing to avoid it. And so that's through these tiny nerve endings that are peppered throughout your fascial tissues, these different proprioceptors, different mechanosensors that provide proprioception, but also these interoceptors that are giving you these subtle sensing perception that isn't necessarily about a physical feeling, but it translates through the lateral thalamic spinal pathway, goes to the insula, and then we have different areas of our brain light up with different emotional feelings. And so we don't always know what the story is. We don't always know why we're feeling what we're feeling, or why rolling on the left side of your abdomen, all of a sudden you had a tear come out on the right side of your face. But I think it's probably a good thing that we allow our body to have its expression, not necessarily need to story about it, not necessarily need to know all the things, but to allow for its expression. And then maybe there's a story, maybe at some point there'll be something logical, or maybe there won't.
Yeah. I appreciate how you can describe that so well of what's actually happening from a physiological level when that process is occurring. Because I think that's like, one, I'm always curious just to like dive deeper to like better my understanding of what's really happening. But it's important. It helps it feel a little less like if this were to feel like woo-woo to someone or out there or strange, of like, like how emotions are stored in our body and our tissue. And we don't need to know the story or the why or the how, just being with them and being present with them and presence with our breath and how that can shift. Yeah. And I think shift then our state of being of, as we're rolling in those gentle ways, as things are moving, releasing, maybe there's tears, maybe there's a clear emotional release, maybe there's not, I think sometimes even that word titration of like, maybe it's like a myriad of small little shifts that there is some emotion releasing, but like, it's not like a huge nervous system release. So you might not so consciously be aware of it, but then that can just, how that shifts how we feel in our body. And I think that that shift how we feel in our body, having more space to breathe, how that completely just correlates to how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to others.
Yeah. And I realized that I think you asked me about breath, and I didn't address breath in that because I was talking about fascia more.
Oh, sure.
But you can find another question to get us back there. That's fine. Haley, what is it?
I asked you like probably 3 questions in one. So yeah. Well, I guess from what you shared and the breath, how does the breath support in connecting into these releases into as you're rolling or as you're being with your body? Where does the breath, how do you see that?
There's lots of different ways that I break down breathing in the book. But I think one of the most coherent ways that I describe the breathing body is I break it into 3 distinctive zones, especially for knowledge of oneself and one's state. And so breathing that occurs below the diaphragm. So the diaphragm lives inside your rib cage. It lines the lower 6 ribs, and it's like a kind of an undulating trampoline in there. And as you breathe in, the diaphragm, its job is to contract. When it contracts, it creates a vacuum that pulls air through your nose or through your mouth, and then all of a sudden your lungs get to inflate. But an abdominal breath, or a zone 1 breath, is when the diaphragm is really moving downward. And as that breath occurs, there's a swelling of the gut, the low back, the waist, the pelvic floor, because the diaphragm's pressure on this organ pillow below it, right? It just distends out. And in zone 1 breathing, we typically are in our most relaxed, sedated, calm space, a high parasympathetic tone in our body, meaning we're chill. If breath moves into the rib cage and lives there exclusively, I call that a zone 2 breath. And in zone 2 breathing, you've got your ribs and your diaphragm working in conjunction to upwardly rotate the ribs on inhale and then downwardly rotate on exhale. The diaphragm moves more in a lateral manner rather than moving downward. And when we're in a zone 2 breath, we're more amplified, we're more energized, we're more in a sympathetic tone. But if we get stuck there and we're always in the sympathetic tone, it can be really hard to ignite a relaxation response, to go into recovery. And so if we kind of live in zone 2 all the time, we'll often flip into an even higher stress zone. And I call that zone 3 breathing. And zone 3 breathing occurs when your shoulders, neck muscles, and face muscles, they are the ones that are trying to get breath into your body. And usually that's accompanied by a big open mouth, kind of a gasp. And it's a relatively shallow breath in terms of how much air you're getting into your body. It really is metabolically costly. And you'll see this when people are under high stress, under duress, under fright, under shock, or even under high delight, right? When you just gasp in ecstasy or surprise. So it's not always a negative thing, but usually a zone 3 breath is short-lived. But, if you live in a chronic state of fear or panic, or like my asthmatic friends, these zone 3 muscles can become so hypertonic that they begin to create interference in other aspects of your well-being. It's very hard to relax when your neck is chronically rigid, and that rigidity from face through neck, as you know, as a rolfer, translates through your shoulder, translates down your elbow into your forearm, wrist, and hands, and you can have all sorts of nerve compression, tingling, carpal tunnel like syndromes, all because we're breathing in zone 3 instead of allowing zone 1 and zone 2 to interact on the regular basis as our dominant breathing zones. So I use these 3 zones to indicate state, help people familiarize themselves with their own home state of breathing, but also how you would want to use the rolling that's within the book to address your own state changes. And if like I always have this pain on the left side of my neck and jaw, well, breathing is a part of that. And so taking a look at your respiratory mechanics, postural mechanics, and then of course, the responsiveness of the soft tissue, it's all a big part of it. And that's what Body by Breath tries to address.
Amazing. And that answers like the question I was going to have was, if somebody notices, like with how you describe the zones of like, oh, I'm mostly here, how can they support themselves in, having more adaptability of the way that they tend to breathe. So Body by Breath. That's, yeah.
Yeah, so I use 4 different sizes of the role model balls. So they're grippy, pliable balls. Like we described the Coregeous ball initially, which is this air-filled ball, but the other balls
Mhm.
are squishy rubber balls that have a lot of grip and a lot of give. And so whoops, so they yield when you approximate bony prominences. So it doesn't just like annoy, pinch, bruise, and shred your skin or the joint junctions underneath, but they can really nestle in and address the high value real estate there, which are all these mechanoreceptive rich tissues. So we can stimulate those, and that can improve our body sense, our proprioception, but also depending on, how we're using them, also attend to this interoceptive field as well.
Awesome. I could ask you a lot more questions, but just for time reins, I'll kind of wrap us up. And I'd love, Jill, for you to share with anyone listening if they're wanting to live, a more embodied life, which I think is like a daily, consistent, like courageous choice. What would you like? Do you have a top practice or suggestion that you would have for somebody if they're wanting to really choose to be in their body more?
I have so many. What is the one thing?
No.
Well, I would tell you to roll around. I definitely would tell you to
Yeah.
roll around. Yeah. And whether that's just you on, obviously I'm a ball person, or just
Mhm.
rolling around on the floor like a child. So finding
Yeah.
something to invest pressure all over your body. One of the things in the book in Body by Breath, I have the burrito roll where you just put yourself in a blanket and you roll yourself up and then you unroll yourself, just introducing novel pressures into your body in different ways. I think those are really fun ways of waking your body up.
Mhm.
You can roll yourself up in a yoga mat, but if you're like, I don't want to buy the balls, I don't have the balls, you can roll up a yoga mat and you can use the grippiness and the springiness of a yoga mat as a self-myofascial release tool. And you can apply pressure into your body, specific pressures into different zones that feel restricted or feel numb or feel maybe problematic for you. And this is just a way to start to map yourself, to get to know yourself. It's the most incredible thing ever. I mean, it's unimaginable how many of our parts have been really taken by, not taken, but have been given over to other experts. Our teeth are the domain of the dentist, our breasts are the domain of our gynecologists. I guess our vaginas are too. And our bones are for the orthopedist, but they're all yours. And so
Yeah.
you're going to get to know yourself. And I think learning your way through your anatomy and being in your breathing body is really thrilling.
And I love that. And but great. I think starting with rolling on the floor, rolling on something is awesome because that's so tangible and accessible, Yeah. Yeah. To start to get that more feedback, more landmark of how you do map from yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Jill. I'm just really grateful again. And I feel like there was just so much wisdom and insight that you shared for people to get started with on, deepening in their journey. And where can folks find out more about your work? And, I'll of course have both of your books linked. Yeah.
Yeah, tuneupfitness.com is my website. I have an online classroom. I teach every week there, and we have live interactive stuff. There's also many courses on the website that might appeal to the different listeners. I have a course with Tom Myers called Rolling Along the Anatomy Trains, where Tom goes through anatomy lectures on his anatomy trains model, and then I do movements and rollouts so that you can map them yourself. There's Walking Well with Katie Bowman, where we cover disassemble walking. There's even a roll into hit. I worked with my friend, Dr. Jen Ferbroni, to help people who are afraid of accelerating their bodies and heart rates, but to do this really safely with a physical therapist and myself. So we're trying to help people introduce that spectrum of movement, because slow reflective movement is really important, but for whole body health and for longevity health, it's important to get correct stresses into your body. So I wanted to make sure that is available to people, especially people who've had joint replacements like myself, who are hesitant to amplify their practices. And lots of other things. I have a program with Kelly Starrett, and I teach Body by Breath online as well as in person, as well as the role model. We're about to launch the role model online, finally recorded the entire training, and that will be released early in the new year. So I'm really excited about that. And then I'm on Instagram at the Jill Miller and at Tune Up Fitness. So you can find us everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. And I'll have that all linked. But yeah, and definitely check out Jill's online courses. And there's so many good resources and places to, get deep in your own practice and deep in your relationship with your body. So awesome. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And hopefully, this inspired you to take some sort of, action towards, whether it just be noticing your breath more through the day, whether it be, maybe spending 5 minutes in the morning, getting on the floor, rolling on your yoga mat, rolling on a ball. Or, here we are in winter. I'm just thinking making a burrito blanket sounds nice. That sounds good and cozy. Yeah. Awesome. So thanks for tuning in. Go check out Jill's work. And Jill, thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Emily.
All right. Take care, everyone.